Chag Sameach. So there is a file on my computer labeled Shemini Atzeret 5784 Yizkor -unused. So when I walked into Shul a year ago on the Hebrew calendar, and I had written something, I think it was about Moses, I'm not sure now. But as the morning rolled on and news rolled in, I know that we did not grasp the enormity of what had happened, of what was still happening. But it was clear that something different needed to be said. And so I spoke from the heart. I spoke about the book of Ecclesiastes we had read that morning. And I said that there is nothing new under the sun, that what was once news becomes history, but that what was once history will undoubtedly become news again. And Yizkor in some ways reflects that. Yizkor was instituted in the Middle Ages as a way of remembering when whole communities were slaughtered, when there were neighborhoods, where there were villages with none to remember them, and so the next town over, they would on the holiday have an observance so that those people for whom there was no one to say Kaddish would not be forgotten. Over the last century, we have had the luxury, if you will, of transforming Yizkor into something more personal. So yes, there are the masses, the names, the 6 million of the Holocaust, the names, the murdered in 1348 and 1349, the murdered in the pogroms, the Inquisition, whose names are mostly lost to us. And instead, we can focus on our individual losses. And at the end of my remarks last year, I just went back and reviewed. I said that year's Yizkor, in some sense, would be anticipatory. And this is the Yizkor that we anticipated. So how do we make sense of where we are at this moment, the second Shemini Atzeret of a new era, a day that is meant to be a day of celebration without bounds, that instead is and always will be also now a Yahrzeit? The Midrash rabbinic telling tells us that Sukkot is a universal holiday. So Sukkot is about nature, it's about the outdoors, and on Sukkot, over the course of the 7 days of the holiday, there were 70 bowls, 70 offerings brought with flour offerings, with wine, with oil, each one for a different nation of the world. Sukkot is about the entire world is under God's umbrella. And Shemini Atzeret, there is just one offering, just one bowl. The idea being that Shemini Atzeret is just for us. Like, yes, I was with everyone, and yet you are special, you are unique. I am singling you out. I love every nation in the world, but there is something special that I have with you. And this year we have learned, we have been reminded that Jews, in fact, are different, not just in the eyes of God, but in the eyes of our fellow human beings. That we are not counted like every other nation. On October 6th of last year, as Sukkot was ending, we were leaving the fragility, the delicate structure and protection of the sukkah with a certain kind of a sense of security. This Sukkot, we understand the fragility of the sukkah, of the structure of the house of sticks in which we dwell. On Sukkot, we read 2 haftorahs, we read 2 prophetic readings that talk about that holiday as being anticipatory of the war that will bring about the coming of the Messiah, the terrible war that will end history. Zechariah says, I will gather all the nations to Jerusalem for war. The city will be captured, the houses plundered, the women violated, and part of the city will go into exile. but the rest of the population shall not be uprooted from the city. Those are words that describe, if not Jerusalem, the towns and the villages 50 miles to the south. Sukkot is about all the nations of the world. Shemini Atzeret is about just us, and somehow we are not treated like every other nation. Because in war is not pretty. In war, there are often atrocities, horrible, horrible things. Sometimes the world intervenes, sometimes the world responds. They send peacekeepers. At worst, and actually most often, there is simply neglect. It does not make the front page of the New York Times or the Journal, right? It is not in the first 72 ads that come up. And so the world says, a couple 100,000 here, a few 100,000 there, that's just the way the world works. What we have experienced this year, we would have been delighted to experience the benign neglect that the world has for war. The courtesies, the protections extended to every other nation, the right to self-determination, the right to self-defense, the right to not be murdered so much. We've experienced that on the world stage, in the UN, on college campuses, in the media, in social media. In fact, the fires were still burning. The hostages were still being dragged into Gaza. And already the damnation, the attacks, for having been the victims of an attack to which we had not yet even respond. All we ask for is the right for self-determination, self-defense, the right to have a place to call our own. What I need to mention is that those who carried out those attacks on October 7th were offered the very same right and refused to accept it if it meant that we could have it too. The last Jews left Gaza 18 years before October 7th. The only ones who remained, the only ones who have been back since, are the ones who were dragged there against their will. It was more important to those who carried out October 7th to kill us than to live themselves. But I want to focus this morning not on those who died for the purpose of destruction. I want to focus on those who died so that others might live. I want to focus on those who died, whose deaths to which we must somehow give meaning today. Because here is the thing, when you read the statistics, 1,200 on October 7th and hundreds more since then, you can get lost in those numbers. So there have been so much to make sense of what this all means. Sukkot is about diversity, about the 70 nations. Shemini Atzeret is let's have just one bull. Let's understand just one nation. Let's understand just one people, one person. And so when you try to make sense of the loss that we are remembering today, there are ways that we can do that. We can start with perhaps those we know in our community. So on Yom Kippur, I spoke about Rose Lubin. She grew up in Dunwoody, was the only young lady to ever letter in cheerleading and in wrestling. She was a fierce young woman. She made Aliyah. She served in the border police where she was the fitness coach for her unit. On October 7th, she was with her adopted family, the James family, in Kibbutz Saad, not far from Gaza. And when the attackers came, she took her weapon, she stood at the gates, and she was one of the few that helped save that community from destruction. Just over a month later, she was doing her duty as a border guard, not as an attacker, but as a defender. She was there to ensure the safety of everyone, Jews, Christians, Muslims, visiting the old city, and she was stabbed by an attacker and passed away. A story that has touched our community that you may not know as well. Dekel Suissa was a member, one of those who comes to Atlanta, Shinim. They come, they spend a year after high school. They put off the rest of their lives by even another year before they have to go back to the army or national service. And they come and they help us learn about Israel, and maybe they even learn a little bit about us. So Dekel was a Shinshin who had spent some time in our community. Now, I'll always remember the last email I got from him. It was towards the end of his year. It was in March. We were corresponding with him. I wish I had gotten to get to know your community a little better. So Dekel was on a small, isolated outpost that morning, and when the first RPG hit the post, he realized that he was actually the only officer on base. And so he was instantaneously promoted to base commander, and he led the operation, the defense. After 4 hours of fighting, Dekel called the Air Force to bomb the position, and he was killed helping an injured comrade, still fending off and eliminating 5 attackers, 5 terrorists as he died. Thanks to Dekel's bravery, most of the soldiers survived, and the position did not fall or surrender. There were those who did not know that they would be choosing to fight that day, but fought nonetheless. Yahav Weiner fought off terrorists as they entered through a bedroom window. He enabled his wife, Shaylee, to escape with their newborn baby. Shaylee and Shaya hid for 27 hours until they were rescued. His cousins, Hadar and Itai Berdashevsky, hid their twin babies as they fought attackers in their home. They were both murdered, but their babies were rescued after 14 hours. I could go on. A book that I received just before Yom Kippur called One Day in October. It is 40 Heroes, 40 Stories. And so it has stories of heroes who perished, like Aner Shapira. I spoke about him on Yom Kippur. He was hiding. He was with about 20 people in a shelter, and as the terrorists threw in grenades, he threw them back out one by one. Yonatan Barnash Tsor saw that terrorists were blocking a road, and he drove his car through them, knocking over motorcycles, billiard balling a truck off the road so that others could get through. And also the heroes who survived, those who lived to tell their stories. We could have a shelf, we could have a library of this book, and it would not be enough. And there are those who lived and whose lives will never be the same, the wounded, the raped, those who continue the fight today. So we've handed out, each of these sheets has the pictures and the names of 4 individuals or 4 families, and each of you has a different one. Sukkot, we're all in this amorphous mass. There's a lulav, there's an etrog, there's a willow, there's a hadas, they're all bundled together. Shemini Atzeret, take a look at one leaf. 4 leaves, 4 species, if you will, that come together. When we recite Yizkor, and I would ask, even if it's your usual practice to leave the room for Yizkor because you are blessed to have no parents who have passed away, perhaps this one time, stay, because there are people who must be remembered who have no one to be in Yizkor for them, if not you. So at the appropriate time, I'll actually ask us each during Yizkor together to read the names of our 4 individuals. And as we read these names and we read a little about their stories, we think that maybe what they accomplished in death, perhaps we can accomplish a small part in life. And yet, as we approach Yizkor, even as we carry this burden of communal, of national loss, we still bear in our hands, we still bear in our hearts those who are dear to us. We are remembering parents, we are remembering spouses and brothers and sisters and friends and children. Our own loved ones call to us and say, wait, remember us too. So I would ask that today somehow we have room in our hearts for both. Because you can ask the question, as we remember the stories of those who we do not know who are on these pieces of paper and of those who we brought with us in our hearts today. We ask, what can they inspire us to do? Can they inspire us to be a little bit more committed to friends and family, to do more for children, for nieces, for nephews, for loved ones, for parents than we thought we could do? To stretch ourselves beyond what we thought we could accomplish, to do something great, to do something, whether it is remembered in a sermon, whether it is remembered in the heart of one person, or whether it is only remembered before God, to do something that is worth remembering. So as we approach the Yizkor this year, we are trying to find a way to transition from a Sukkot, from a Mass that's indifferentiable, to remember to differentiate and to hold our loved ones and our heroes in our hearts, one at a time, one by one, each unique, each remembered.